Welcome back friends and good morning to NPTEL online certification course on Indian poetry in English. We are now going to discuss lecture number 17. Prior to this, as you remember well, we have discussed Jeev Patel, who also comes to Indian English poetry as an existentialist and also as an experimentalist because of his profession. In this lecture today, we are going to talk about yet another big name which many of you might be familiar with, and the name is none other than Pritish Nandy. You might be knowing Pritish Nandy as a journalist, as a promoter of films, as a producer rather, but initially Pritish Nandy began his career as a poet. So, let us look at the poetic oeuvre of Pritish Nandy, and we shall also see how Pritish Nandy came to be Pritish Nandy and how he also divided and distributed himself in different areas and proved his own worth, proved his own meaning, and established himself as a man who can always be reckoned with. My dear friends, Pritish Nandy in himself combines not only a poet, but a painter, a promoter, fine, a producer, but at the heart of all these lies Pritish Nandy's poetry. Now, as we have always seen that whenever we talk about any poet, the first thing that we discuss is who the poet is and what actually was his early career like, because whatever one does that has got an imprint on a poet's entire poetry. Pritish Nandy was born in 1951, and that also in Bhagalpur in the state of Bihar in eastern India, to a Bengali Christian family. Pritish is an Indian poet, and you might be happy to note that Pritish Nandy is still there and still working. So, he is a poet, painter, journalist. He was also a sort of parliamentarian, fine, and then of course, he is a filmmaker. Many of you might be knowing him through his films as well. He had to his credit several awards, namely E.M. Forster Literary Award in 1976. You might be surprised to know that only at the age of 25 he was actually given Padma Shri Award. He was such a prolific poet, and but he did not confine himself only to the world of poetry, because there were so many other skills in him. We have been watching and reading that majority of the poets, especially Indian English poets, they had some or the other way their association with journalism, though they started working with many journals, many periodicals, and so Pritish Nandy was also not an exception in this regard. He had been the editor of Illustrated Weekly for quite some time, fine, for a longer period of more than 3 or 4 years. Then he was also associated with the Times of India for 9 years between 1982 and 1981. He was also nominated as a poet laureate by the World Academy of Arts and Culture at 5th World Congress of Poets in Francisco in the year 1981. So, Pritish rose to fame very early, and he had also his acquaintances all over the world. He became very popular as a poet. He was also associated with the Independent, then Filmfare, Femina, Science Today, Dharma Yog and Madhuri. It was later that once Pritish Nandy said a goodbye to the world of poetry, because he had so many loves and several loves collided with each other also, and then he bid adieu to the world of poetry, and then he also founded Pritish Nandy Communications in 1993, and he remains its non-executive chairman even today. You might also remember that there used to be a very famous show, Pritish Nandy show on Indian televisions. So, Pritish is such a prolific name, he has been called by many people as prolific poets. Now, Pritish just in the beginning of his career, he started writing poems, and he had several collections to his name. He started with Of Gods and Olives in 1967, then came On Either Side of Arrogance from Calcutta's Writers Workshop, then Riding the Midnight River, selected poems, which came out in 1974, then Lone Song Street, which became very famous because this Lone Song Street was later also sung by, there are 12 poems in it, and it was later sung by Pritish Nandy and Mallika Saravai. It is already available. So, those who have a yearning to listen to it, they can listen, they can enjoy. They can also listen to the voice of Pritish Nandy, and the way he has given it the voice, it actually looks very beautiful, and the meanings appear quite clear. Though the poet is of a different genre, the poet actually at times imitates the avant-garde movement, or at times he also, because he was also a sort of experimentalist. Among the few experimentalists that we can make a mention of, Pritish Nandy is also one of them. He also had a collection with Kamala Das, and the collection entitled The Savage Right, This Savage Right, fine, Tonight This Savage Right, that is actually the name of the collection. Then came In Secret Anarchy in 1976 by United Writers, and then The No Hair Man, which is a sort of, from the title it appears it is a sort of realization, but we shall also read some of the lines from No Hair Man. Then again, after a long time, after a long time, Pritish again came back to the world of poetry when he wrote again, when he got his own collection again, and then came Stuck on 1/40 in 2012. He also got, fine, Peerless of Minds, an Arc of Achievement in 2019. So, his poetic oeuvre is quite rich and quite plenty. We do not have much time to get into or to have a look at all the works, but we will take some of the major works that can show Pritish Nandy's poetic caliber as a poet. Of course, Pritish Nandy may not be that much familiar in among his contemporary poets, but whatever he has written, they actually have a different sort of impression, and then he is known more outside than in his own country. So, let us have a look at the special features or the salient features of Pritish Nandy's poems. Actually, for the first time when he wrote one poem entitled Calcutta, If You Must Exile Me, he became very famous. Pritish Nandy, as he is an experimentalist, you will find that there is no set pattern in his poems. It is always said that Pritish is a love poet, and his obsession and his connection is more with the body. There is more of imagination, and this imagination is soaked in the imagination of the body, in the imagination of a persona that is absence, in the imagination of one who is not there, yet he feels the tinge of it. So, we can find that in majority of Pritish Nandy's poems, there is wild energy and verbal and verbal belligerence, my dear friend. You can find that there are many critics also who have gone to the extent of saying that Pritish uses more and more of words, even though that may not be required. One poet has gone to the extent of saying that there is a lot of nimiety, something that should not have been much, unnecessary use of words. And then Pritish can be considered to be a poet who is confined to the urban world. And here you can also get a sort of attestation of the fact that Pritish's loyalties were also divided into journalism, into advertising, and that he had actually sensed that world by being very close to it, by being very close to it. That is why we can find a sort of urban violence, the theme of horror, death and sex is actually prevalent in his work. Of course, there are political protests here and there, and that actually he has got a sort of license because of his association with journalism. Then he also is very famous because of his love songs, which actually were poems, pop poems you can call it. If you listen to that Lone Song Street poems, which are 12 in number, you can find that majority of those poems can be sung, and that have also been sung. So, the themes around which his poetic oeuvre surrounds are political, social and personal. And in the 60s, especially in the second half of the 60s, there is a sort of experimentation that was actually being represented by none other than Pritish Nandy. So, it is time that we took some of the poems in order to measure the depth, in order to measure the merit of this poet Pritish Nandy. Pritish Nandy, even though many people might say many things about Pritish Nandy, but what Nandy himself says is of utmost importance and has got much weight to pull. What he says is, the use of symbols is also invariably a deliberate attempt. No? Pritish in many of his interviews had said that audacity is his actually strength. So, what he says about the use of symbols and myths, because you can find that his poetry is a bit complex also, and this complexity has been brought because of the use of symbols and myths. So, he says the use of symbols is also invariably a deliberate attempt, since a straight statement is not enough, to communicate a specific idea. The poet resorts to an oblique reference or symbols. When we read his poems, we will find that there is a different sort of obliqueness in majority of his poems. So, what he says is, straight statement is not enough to communicate a specific idea. There is a conflict between idea and ideals in the poetry of Pritish Nandy. The poet resorts to oblique reference or a symbol. My idiom and my language belong to my time. So, maybe the poets today could find a fault in the use of symbols and myths and in terms of language, but he says my idiom and my language belong to my time, which often makes it necessary to use a particular symbol which is neither time based nor time bound. The symbol conveys meaning. That is why we find meaning with the help of symbols that Nandy creates in his poetic world. Now, the poem that I was talking about, my dear friend, please listen to each and every word of the poem to see not only the poet's anguish, but how the poet looked at. And even though Calcutta becomes the base, you know that majority of the poems of the Bombay circle, they were writing about Bombay, Bombay was the background, but here in Pritish Nandy you can find Calcutta is the background in the backdrop, and what he says you can find and you can listen and you can find the nuances, the way he portrays the city life, the urban life and the other side of the urban life, the ugliness of the urban life, how beauty is being relegated to the margins in an urban atmosphere. That is what the poet says. Let us read the lines of the poem. Calcutta, exile me if you must. Exile me, und my lips before I go. Und my lips before I go, only words remain and the gentle touch of your finger on my lips. Calcutta, burn my eyes before I go into the night. The poet is actually obsessed with Calcutta, but when he looks at the other side of Calcutta, he actually feels very desperate. And then he says, before I leave Calcutta, you must exile me. The headless corpse in a Dhakuria by lane, the battered youth, his brains blown out, and the silent vigil that takes you to where they will Paltandanga Lane, where they will gun you down without vengeance or hate, without vengeance or hate. Now, in a way, we also get the description of several lanes of Calcutta, and we also get the several ugly acts, several cruel acts that are being perpetrated on the city, and the city becomes very infamous. The city is in talk, the city is in news, but for a wrong reason, and that is why the poet, thinking himself to be one of the representatives of the city Calcutta, he says, Calcutta, if you must exile me, burn my eyes before I go, because I cannot see the treachery, I cannot see the sort of imbalance that is there in a beautiful city which can be considered to be a city of joy, which has been considered to be. They will pull you down from the Ochterlony monument and torture each broken rib beneath your upthrust breasts. They will tear the anguish, no, the sort of persecution which has been perpetrated on people from your sullen eyes, and thrust the bayonet between your thighs. Calcutta, they will tear you apart, Jarasandha like. Now see, the poet is talking about Calcutta, but the poet actually makes a mention of Jarasandha, a famous figure in the Mahabharata. You know, Jarasandha actually stands for, Jarasandha was actually the son of King Brihadrat. Now there goes a story behind it, that King Brihadrat had married the queens of Kashi, and he had got no issues. So once a sage named Chanda Kanishka came, and Chanda Kanishka gave a fruit to Brihadrat. What Brihadrat did, Brihadrat gave this fruit to two of his queens, and then the person who was born was this Jarasandh. But since he actually was, it was divided, no? It was divided. The other half and the two halves were different. So king was very unhappy, and king decided to throw these two parts into a forest. But then there was Jara. Jara was a goddess of the forest, and Jara picked it up, one in left hand and the other in right hand. And Jara actually, when she brought both her hands together, it was actually combined and it became Jarasandh. And then she came to the king's court, and the king had to accept it with the counsel of Chanda Kanishka, and this was Jarasandh. Jarasandh was a very brave one, and you may know from your study of Mahabharata that Jarasandh was finally killed by Bhim, because Jarasandh was so powerful that he attacked on Mathura 17 times, 17 times. And finally, Jarasandh was actually killed by Bhim. So here there is a reference of Jarasandha. Calcutta, they will tear you apart, Jarasandh like. They will tie your hands on either side and hang you from a wordless cross. When your silence protests, they will execute all the words that you meant and synchronized. Calcutta, they will burn you at the stake. Calcutta, flex the vengeance in your thighs and burn silently in the despair of flesh. You can find the bodily images every now and then, how the body is being perpetrated in Calcutta. I mean, Calcutta is just a symbol, and through this symbol he is actually talking about the perpetrations that are being done or created, that are being enacted in a city. If you feel like suicide, take a rickshaw to Sonagachi and share the sullen pride in the eyes of women who have willfully died. And here there is another reference to Sonagachi, which is actually famous for a red light area where the women the poet also has a sort of sympathy with these miserable women, and he says that if you feel like suicide, take a rickshaw to Sonagachi and you will find how they are also suffering, these women at Sonagachi. Wait for me outside the Ujala theatre, and I will bring you the blood of that armless leper who went mad before hunger and death met in his wounds. So the city which you think is very beautiful, it had its own horror, it has its own realities. And Calcutta, if you really want to exile me, burn my eyes. I will show you the fatigue of that woman who died near Chitpur out of sheer boredom and the cages at Bara Bazaar where passion hides in the wrinkles of virgins who have aged, waiting for sexless war that never came. So you can find, if you have a proper reading of the poem, you can find that the poet is actually hinting towards the brutalities, towards the cruelties, towards the malignness of a city which actually outwardly looks so attractive, so beautiful. So in a way, the poet not only talks about Calcutta, but the poet talks about the horrid realities, the external realities which actually are external realities, which actually cover the internal realities which are there. So the cry of the city can be witnessed in it. And then the poem continues and continues, and then the poet says, only obscene lust remains in their eyes after time has withered their exacting thighs. And I will show you the hawker who died with Calcutta in his eyes, aspiration, ambition. Calcutta, if you must exile me, destroy my sanity before I go. So those people who feel that Calcutta is a beautiful place or a city is a beautiful place, it is better I tell them, oh Calcutta, you must exile me, destroy my sanity before I go. So having read this poem, you can also come to some of the conclusions. As we have discussed, the poet is not only making a sort of emotional identification with the city, but he is actually talking about the sickness, the cruelty, the violence. There is a nostalgic strain because the poet spent majority of his time in Calcutta in the early days. We have seen how the poet has also incorporated the myth of Jarasan, and then what the poet actually hints at is the existential crisis all of us are facing within. All of us are actually looking for a meaning. All of us are looking for the search of the self. There is actually a quest that we are undergoing. It is right to go with or to suppose Suresh Kohli, who regards this poem as Nandi's finest individual poem. So if Nandi can be remembered only for one poem, I think he should be remembered for Calcutta, if you must exile me, burn my eyes, destroy my sanity. There are some other poems also which we can just make a passing reference, or in order to know, in order to understand what poetic oeuvre that is being represented by Pritish Nandy. There is another poem which also talks about the dirt, the darkness, and the poem is entitled Speak What is Darkness. At times you will find the lines of Pritish Nandy appearing to be very oblique, but it is oblique with a purpose, and the purpose is that he will give you a symbol, and he says that his symbol is time bound, his symbol is timely, because straightway you cannot say everything. We speak what is darkness, our love is like memory, your eye is the night. Now the poet actually talks about love. The poet is excessively obsessed with love, fine, and you can find in one poem after another love in its own manifestation, and here the poet says, our love is like memory, your eye is the night. Your eye is the night where I forget everything. It is there. One can also say that in your night I am actually trying to find out the meaning, I am trying to find out the real meaning of life. Outside us nothing exists. There is nothing outside us. Everything is in us, everything is within, everything is in our bodies, everything is in our limbs. Rivers that cannot run, bodies that cannot desire, ships that cannot sail. Fine. So speak what is darkness. What is darkness? Rivers that cannot run. I mean the flow that cannot run, the flow that is obfuscated. Bodies that cannot desire, the bodies which have got a desire, but there is no freedom, you cannot desire. And ships which actually want to sail, the heart which wants to fly, but it cannot, ships that cannot sail. Outside us, what is there? Outside us, the wind tracing footsteps, whispers that cannot be heard, houses we have never visited, waterfalls we have never seen, outside us streets run into streets, So, outside us what is there? Waterfalls we have never seen, outside us there are only streets, running into streets, complexities my dear friend, complexities. And then if you analyze this poem also, you can find that there is a sort of correspondence between lovers, even though the lovers may not exist there, but then there is a sort of imagination, the personal space of lovers, the personal choice of lovers, the personal feelings of lovers. So, the poem may appear to be brisk and unconventional. There is no punctuation. That no punctuation also means to say that there is a cry for freedom, and you can find there are nature images. Nature images actually tell you to the ocean of love. So, out and out this poem can be considered to be a love poem my dear friends. So, when Pritish Nandy speaks or writes, what he speaks is through the images, and the images are all that of love. Now, after that, one more important collection is actually worth mentioning, and as I told you, this collection entitled Lone Song Street. This Lone Song Street had got 12 poems, and all these 12 poems actually are a depiction, delineation, deliberation of love, love to a beloved, and beloved's love to a lover, and what their feelings are. And this actually became so popular when it was sung, it became so popular that it sold 20,000 copies my dear friend. This is also available because it was later converted into a film. So, we can read it, and it has already been sung, so you can enjoy listening to it. When you have crossed the bustling main streets of ever land, you reach a lonesome street called the Never Strand. Then you take the turning left, and you take the turning right, and where the twilight breaks, you turn your ragged sight. Round the dusk fall where it is blue, lonesome streets wait for you. Lonesome hour is when the asphalt cracks with the far off steps of a strange malhar. Lonesome hour is when the first rain chases the whirlwind midnight train. Lonesome hour is when our love declares wild oats have turned again to wilder grain, and when it is time to return, to turn to where the sandstorms burn, in the stern eye of the twilight, come and wait for me there. I mean, here is actually a sort of condition, the condition of a lover who actually talks about the lone song street, and he also talks about the lone song hour, and then he says that when that hour is there, you can come and wait for me there. I shall, and then he comes up with a promise, and we are reminded of Andrew Marvell here. When Andrew Marvell in one of his poems Andrew Marvell, he actually promises his beloved all sorts of things that he could have given her had he got the time. So, the poem begins with, had I got the hour, fine, this quietness lady were no crime. But here Pritish Nandy says, I shall open the cyclone of the trees, and wrapped in the tendrils of the fire, I shall bring you a poem in a raging sapphire. When you have crossed the tired highway, and you have crossed the fevered night, and where the twilight breaks, you turn your ragged sight, round the dusk fall, where it is blue, lonesome street waits for you, lonesome street waits for you. So, this is out and out a love poem, and here we can find the poet's craving, the poet's longings, and longings in an hour, and these longings are in the form of lone song songs. When in a lone song hour at a lone song street, the lover is waiting for, and with all sorts of conditions, with all sorts of promises, but then is there a possibility of love today present? Now we come to another important volume where we can find a sort of transition of a person who was soaked in love to somebody becoming the nowhere man. So, this nowhere man, from the title it appears that the poet actually talks about a person of the new world, a person who is a nowhere man. And again, there also he finds that he is a nowhere man. Why? Again, perhaps because he has been deprived of something. And what is that something that we can find when we read this beautiful poem? Come, let us pretend this is a ritual. This hand in your hair, your tongue seeking mine, this cataclysmic despair, let us pretend tonight that you are mine forever. For when daybreak returns, we shall realize once more that forever means an empty room, a tired night swirling into nowhere when I soar up to your tattered skyline. The poet here says that here is a nowhere man, and that is why, since I am a nowhere man, let me pretend, because you cannot say forever, because when the daybreak returns, we shall realize once more that forever means an empty room. I mean, this life which we are all looking forward to being a very beautiful exercise is an exercise in futility without love. So, what is true is only you, what is true is only love, what is true is your feeling of being one and the other, of being one together. At midnight, I move in on strangers for the caress or the kill. I have come to terms with shadows. I have come to terms with shadows. So, when I look at people, they are only, what are they? They are merely shadows. So, I have come to terms with shadows. I have been assaulted by gentler love times. Once in a long while a face comes near, our eyes meet in challenge. Or is it love? Our bodies come alive in secret oneness. So, we are perhaps living in a sort of illusion, no? All of us are living in a sort of illusion that everything is going to be permanent, everything is going to be a source of perennial joy, but that is not, perhaps it is only a sort of illusion. Our bodies come alive in secret oneness. One spring ago, terrified to be touched, you draw me tonight at last, deep within your frantic countryside. Fine? The poet actually becomes so impatient that he says there is nothing to wait for. So, whatever way we meet, perhaps that is only an illusion, and we are all the nowhere man. And then again, as he moves further, the poet says, the wind disentangles itself from your fringed body as hurricanes of dreams follow me. Eternity is only a river reaching towards the sea. Eternity is only a river reaching towards the sea. My tongue travels to your navel and downwards I cling to your body. My mouth breathes in the shadow of your breath. Someday perhaps the sea will reveal itself, the delirium of the flesh fatigue at dawn. So, the poet actually makes some very unusual imaginations and unusual fears and anxieties that without love he cannot survive. And then he says that eternity is only a river reaching towards the sea. At times we may feel that the poet is out and out, a hopeless fellow, but then what the poet talks of is not without or not devoid of any logic. What poet actually tries to say is that we cannot only go by reasoning, we also have to think of out of the box. And then he says, it hurts to say I am sorry, so let us use unfamiliar words. Let us forget those repetitive words. Let us use unfamiliar words. The summer has gone, the ground's turned cold. The old road calls me back again. We live in memories, we live in desires. Another time we shall meet again, as strangers or friends, or perhaps as lovers once again. Now turn to the rain again, because this rain will not come again. There is a feeling of carpe diem. The feeling of carpe diem means that whatever is there presently, you have to enjoy, you have to utilize, because whatever we look forward to is only a sort of empty dream. Tonight, and then as he proceeds further, he says, tonight I draw your body to my lips, your hand, your mouth, your breast, the small of your back. I draw blood to secret nerve and gently kiss their tips. As you move under me, anchored to a rough sea, I cling to you, your music and your knees. I touch the secret vibes of your body. I fill my hands with the darkness of your hair. The passion alone can resurrect our love. It is not the passion alone that can resurrect our love, but the feeling of being in love, the feeling or the imagination or the yearning to be, or the yearning to enjoy whatever is at the present, that actually is important. Otherwise, whatever swearings we make, all those are simply hollow. So it is a time to make love, it is a time to enjoy. The present time is the more important time, and that we should not forget. That should not be invited. Rather, whatever is there before us has to be exploited, has to be used. Nandi was actually criticized too much because he was excessively soaked in the pleasures of the body. But what Nandi says on his own poetic craft actually is an eye-opener. What Nandi says is, I write for those who can never read the language. I write for those who can never read the language. I use and write in a language that has no roots in my country. That is why many people say that he became popular outside the country more. So there is a sort of openness that can be found in his poems. But my voice is the voice of my people, for I speak of their loves and ambition. I speak of their loves and ambitions. That is why Nandi is considered to be a very modernistic. And secret sames my eyes share, the hunger of the shameless woman who makes dispassionate love on the pavement. No? The hunger of the shameless woman who makes dispassionate love on the pavement, whose large black nipples remind me of my mother, who is now old and lonely. So he is actually talking of those people who have really been deprived of love, and also a sense of belonging, also a sort of the right or the sort of choice that they deserve. So they have been deprived of, and that is why he says, I write for their loves and ambitions. I also write for the dispassionate love of the woman on the pavement. I write for those who will craft a new country. I mean, we can find a new change, not only in terms of language, but also a new experiment that we have found, because Pritish Nandy was also one of the major experimentalists. Now, having discussed, I have simply shown you, I have simply made you acquainted with some of the poems of Pritish Nandy, but you can also read it at your own leisure and pleasure, since Nandi was also fighting for or struggling for a search of meaning, a search of communication that really got when he bid adieu to the world of poetry and joined the world of movies, the world of say painting, the world of publishing, the world of journals. So what his other critics or his contemporaries have said, but Nandi, in the eyes of his own, he believed that he was actually trying to write for those people who cannot understand language. He wanted to be the representative of those people who actually were deprived of certain rights. Now, let us look at some of the lines of the critics. Srinivas Iyengar, you all might have heard the name of, because his book Indian Writing in English, that became a seminal book, and it was only the effort of Srinivas Iyengar that Indian writing today is Indian writing. So, what he says about Nandi is of course very remarkable. Nandi's fecundity as a poet is obvious enough, meaning thereby as a poet Nandi is very fertile, but the reader is often put out, meaning thereby he does not take readers when he is writing for them. And then because he was an experimentalist, that is why you can find that punctuations are quite open. He does not follow, there is no conformity to standard rules. He says ever ever land, never never strand. These words you cannot find usually in the world of English language, but then he experiments, and that is why the typographical oddities seem frightening enough. The titles are intriguing. No, Calcutta, fine, you must exile me. See, the title is very intriguing. The images disconcerting. The images are very disconcerting. And then what he advises to the readers is read without preconception. You have to read Nandi without any preconception. However, the apparently ill assorted, he calls ill assorted and chaotically permuted words convey the distinct nuances of meaning that we expect from a poet. There is much innovative, of course, there is a lot of innovation that he does, and that is why he sings his own poems in the form of Lone Song Street. There is much innovative audacity in the expression. Audacity is actually a weapon for Pritish Nandy. Staccato formations and Pythonist twists, unusual, which may appear to be a sort of aberration, and the turns of phrases, they actually sock only to satisfy. So, this is what Iyengar says. We can also take in the views of some other critics. M.K. Naik says, Nandi's verse gives us the impression of wild energy and belligerence, as if he is fighting with words. Only occasionally amenable, only occasionally motivating to discipline, a verse of which nimiety, meaning thereby something which is actually in abundance, unnecessary abundance, is at once a source of power and weakness. It is both a source of power as well as of weakness. Nandi, as Stephen King, what Stephen King says actually summarizes, because Stephen King had done a lot of research on Indian poetry in English, especially modern Indian poetry in English, and what he says is, Nandi appears to have imitated the obscurity, the images are obscure, obliqueness, the references are not straight, as Nandi himself also admits, and radical juxtapositions. So, he juxtaposes of avant-garde poetry without having a clear reason for such experimentation. He does not tell us why there is such an innovation in his poetry, but then one cannot deny the fact that his poetry has a sort of nimiety, his poetry has a sort of obliqueness and radical juxtaposition without giving us a clear region. So, these are the views of the critics about Pritish Nandy, but now we have to make our own conclusion having a look at some of the major poems of Pritish Nandy, and we can say that Nandi is a multifaceted personality, a multifaceted genius. That is why his royalties are in different fields, and his early poetry is superficially modernistic. Early poetry is superficially modernistic. Of course, at the later stage he actually tries to mend his own fences, just like the other poet G. Patel that we mentioned. His poetry actually ranges from political protest to popular lyrics song, as in Lone Song Street we have found. His most characteristic contribution is prose poetry. You can find even in that Calcutta you must exile me, that there are more than sufficient lines which appear to be very prosaic, but that was a new style, that was actually an innovation which Nandi was trying to derive a pleasure out of it in order to say what he really wanted to say. There are images of love and sex, violence and horror, death and decay are found abundantly in Nandi's world. Nandi actually, we can conclude, Nandi excels in experimental verse, and his poetry mixes memory with desire, like that of T.S. Eliot, isn't it? And dream as well as of silence. Now, having concluded with these points, we can finally end this lecture with some very important lines from one of his very famous book, which he wrote later, which is titled Again, and where he actually gives us, once again he gives us an echo of what his poetic craft is, and it is not devoid of reality. When he says, poetry always starts with words, when words start to hurt, we pause, regain our innocence and start again, but this time it is not poetry, it is life writing itself out in a strange unfinished way, what you may choose to call an autobiography of sorts. So, my dear friends, this is what Nandi believes in, and what he says is, what you may choose to call an autobiography of sorts, and that is why Nandi, not only Nandi, but all the poets would agree, and all the lovers of poetry would agree, that poetry always starts with words, words which mean, words which also refer to, and words which actually break the silence of the seas, words which allow the flow of the river, words which allow the rhythm of the ships, words which prompt the whispers to take its own shape on the piece of paper, and that is what poetry is. With this, we come to the end of today's lecture, and I thank you all for being patient and listening to these words. Thank you once again, and I wish you good night.